What is your router responsible for? You need to figure that out, because there might be services running on that router that you don't need to have running. For example, the DHCP service, or maybe the DNS service. If those are running on the router and they don't need to be running, then we potentially have a security vulnerability. What about CDP? That external interface going to the internet, do we really need CDP running? No. No, unless it's absolutely mandatory because of a service or that relies on CDP to be running. But if that's not the case, then we should be shutting that off, because CDP's handing out information about our router out that interface connected to the internet, saying, hey, this is me, this is what I have running as an operating system, this is the type of router I am. Okay, now that can be collected and used later on for an attack on the router, because we know the specs as a malicious user of that router. Same thing with proxy ARP. Do we want proxy ARP running? Do we want our router to be able to respond to ARP requests that aren't specifically sent to itself? You got to think about that in your organization. So let's go to the live environment and let's take a look at some of these and see how we can disable them. The first service I want to look at is DNS. How do we shut off DNS name resolution on our router? Now, why might you want to do that? Well, if your router doesn't have to perform any lookups of domain names, and you have not specified a particular DNS server for it to do lookup names on, then every single lookup it has to do is going to be broadcasted out to 255.255.255.255. So that generates some extra broadcast traffic on the network, and we may want to shut that off. We can go into global configuration mode and type in no IP domain lookup. And that will disable the router from doing any type of DNS lookup or DNS query for any type of name resolution. If you've never heard of the finger service, the finger service allows a user to view other active users. And there are many, many known ways as to how this particular service can be misused, compromised, for malicious purposes. You definitely want to consider disabling the finger service, unless it's absolutely necessary for users to view other active users. To shut it off, you type in no IP finger, and that disables it. CDP is a great protocol. Cisco Discovery Protocol. It's a layer 2 protocol, and it allows Cisco devices to discover each other and learn about each other. And this is really important in the voice world. On switch interfaces that are connected up to phones, CDP is utilized for the switch to discover the phone, for the exchange of information. So it is a service that would be necessary there. But our routers that are at the edge of the network, should we be running CDP on those interfaces that are connected up to extranet partners or connected up to the internet or maybe even connected up to the WAN? No, it's not necessary. Remember what CDP does. It hands out information about our router. This is me. This is my host name. This is my IP addresses that I have. I'm using this particular IP address on this particular interface. This is my operating system. This is my platform ID. That's a lot of information that, if captured, a malicious user could do a search on the internet for vulnerabilities for that particular device based on that platform, based on that operating system. So if CDP is not necessary on the device at all, you type in no CDP run, and that shuts it off globally. Just completely shuts it off. It's like going to your electrical panel in your house and shutting off the power that's coming in from outside. It's completely off. All the power ceases to exist inside your house. However, what if you want to disable it on an interface-by-interface basis? Well, you can go to interface that you want to disable it on and type in no CDP enable. So it's run if you want to do it globally, and it's enable if you want to do it on an interface-by-interface basis. But remember, if you shut it off globally, you can't enable it on an interface by interface basis. It's like going to your electrical panel, shutting off the power coming in from outside from the electrical company, and then trying to turn on lights inside your house. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. So it has to be on globally if you want to run it on the interfaces. So you can prune it, and it's recommended that you prune it on interfaces where it's not absolutely necessary to prune it. BootP is the predecessor to DHCP. What does DHCP do? It gives it IP addresses and subnet masks as an example. Well, BootP did the same thing. I say did because we don't use BootP typically today. We rely on DHCP. But it's important to realize that BootP has a way that malicious users can use it to steal an iOS image. Therefore, we should consider shutting off the BootP server service on our routers and avoid using it. So no IP, BootP server. Now, in addition to that, you might want to consider shutting off any DHCP server services on your router if your router is not going to be a DHCP server. There's no reason to run the DHCP service on the router if it's not going to be a DHCP server. So that's another option you might want to consider in global configuration mode. Typing in no IP DHCP server, no IP DHCP server in order to protect your environment. And lastly, you might want to consider disabling proxy ARP. It is on by default on our router interfaces. Let's look at the output of interface gigabit Ethernet 1/0. Let's go back. Let's type in the correct command, show IP interface gigabit Ethernet 1/0. And we'll see here (2/0). There we go. Wrong interface. So interface 1/0, we can see here that proxy ARP is enabled. So what does this mean? When proxy ARP is enabled, what occurs is that the router, if it receives an ARP request that is not for itself, it will respond to the ARP request if it has an entry in the routing table to reach that particular device. So what does that mean? It means that if a router or another device sends out an ARP request, and that ARP request is for a device that is not on the local network that the device belongs, the router is going to respond on its behalf. Wow. So that destination could be really far away, yet this router is saying, hey, use my MAC address to reach them. And that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. Because we will now have a lot of devices inside that local area network that have ARPed for IP addresses that are outside the local area network, or MAC addresses for IP addresses that are outside the local area network. And what is happening? This router is responding every single time. Use my MAC address, use my MAC address. That's an excessive amount of ARP requests and ARP replies that are going to be happening in the organization. So we definitely want to consider disabling this feature on an interface by interface basis if it's not necessary. So interface gigabit Ethernet 2/0 no IP proxy ARP, and that will disable it. So do show IP interface gigabit Ethernet 2/0, and now you can see proxy ARP is disabled. So if all of a sudden we receive an ARP request and it's not for us, and we do have a route to that particular IP address that's in the ARP request, no, we just ignore it. We don't respond to it because we're not allowed to anymore with proxy ARP off.